Hello, my name is David Ferris, and for this video critical report, I'm going to be discussing an article titled "The Interests and the Affections: The Dangers of Lawful Lending in the Merchant of Venice." This article was written by Lauren Garrett, and it was published in the winter 2014 edition of the Journal for Early Modern Cultural Studies. The reason I chose this article and actually, sought it out is because I found the economic practices of Merchant of Venice to be rather, odd, to say the least. When it comes down to interest, I'm not used to reading that a lender would rather demand a pound of flesh over money to cover the interest costs of a loan. So I did a little bit of digging for this project, and I found Garrett's article. In her article, Garrett discusses the various economic practices and principles of the individual characters within the play, in particular Shylock. Go figure. And she examines how these practices both reflect and reject the Christian ideal of interest. Now, it's rather intriguing that, she examines how they reflect Christian ideals, because the initial concept of interest was that a borrower would ask for money from a lender, and the lender would promise money and demand repayment by a certain date, but the only reason that he or she would be lending money was for the fact that they would have a vested interest in the success of whatever the borrower was asking for the money for. And in her own terms, Garrett defines this as being very Christian-like, for the simple fact that you help out your fellow man by lending them money if you have it, and expecting success and celebrating that success whenever you are finally repaid with a certain amount of interest tacked on. And that's where we get the term interest from in terms of economic practices. So, and then from the outset of the entire article, Garrett decides to tell the reader, or actually decides to inform the reader, that there is a distinct difference between two economic terms in loaning and borrowing money, those terms being interest and usury. Though they have the same literal definition, extra money paid on top of a loan in reimbursement, usury actually was deemed illegal in 1571 as being a morally wrong and unethical practice of business. The reason that she decides to make this distinction is that earlier critics of the play have labeled Shylock as a usurer and have interchangeably used the terms interest and usury in discussing his economic practices and the motivations behind him lending Antonio the money. So after she goes into this discussion of the difference between honest interest, or true interest as she discusses, and usury, she also discusses the four different titles that interest that borrowers could take interest out in, if that makes sense. Let me try to explain that a little bit better. So there were four different forms of interest during the time that The Merchant of Venice was written and performed, and these were deemed to be more more morally ethical and, righteous for fellow citizens. Anyway, my Latin is a little rusty, so I'm going to do my best and explain these, at least list them off. So the 4 different types were the poena conventionalis, which translates to conventional penalty, damum emergens, emergent loss, lucrum cessans, a little bit more French than I expected, sorry, which translates to cessant gain, and periculum sortis, which translates to risky ventures. Garrett identifies the loan in The Merchant of Venice as a form of poena conventionalis, with the conventional penalty being that there is an interest rate of at least 10% on top of the loan that Antonio must repay. However, he distorts this conventional penalty and asks for a pound of flesh from Antonio instead. As she continues throughout her article, Garrett also makes us aware that in lending and borrowing money, there's a certain amount of emotions involved when it comes to lending money to your fellow man. And this idea is, again, we harken back to the concept behind interest, which is to see the person you are lending money to succeed ultimately so that they can pay you back, plus some form of interest on top in terms of reimbursement. So that's where the affections part comes in. But in her discussion of how Shylock's loan falls under the conventional practices of interest during this time, she also discusses how it could be labeled as usury, for the simple fact that it seems that Shylock is extorting Antonio when he is unable to repay the loan, and thus goes to trial and imprisons the man before ultimately he gets out of it. She discusses how the trial, the imprisonment, and everything that happens to Antonio was actually standard fare of the time, and even interprets this as just standard protocol for any type of default on a loan, just in general. Overall, I found this article to be very interesting for the simple fact that she asserts that Shylock actually practices Christian lending, even though he is a Jewish man. I found that interesting because of her explanation for this. During this time, the rhetoric of the law in terms of interest and how it could be applied was made very, very plain, so that there was no possibility for usurers to exploit the law and extort people out of money. However, Shylock manages to somehow circumvent this and use the rhetoric of Christian lending or free lending to work in his favor, and get revenge on Antonio by making the interest a pound of flesh rather than the standard 10% or lower of the initial loan. So I found this article interesting because it discusses just how far a man is willing to go in terms of revenge, and ultimately how unsuccessful his economic practices ultimately are. So I hope that I was able to inform you about some economic principles that even I was unaware of. And that's all I've got. Thank you.